Hi, my name is Zacarias from Hispanidad Translations, and I'm here with Jason from Only Getting Better.
Thanks, guys. Welcome.
Um, so we're gonna discuss some terms that I find important for our Spanish-speaking and Hispanic Americans, both in the United States and in Hispanoamerica, whether that's Mexico, Peru, Argentina, Colombia, even the Philippines as well. But I find it's time to have these talks and just to clarify some things, and to dive in a little bit into the Spanish Black Legend.
So, let's begin with, I would say, these four terms. First, Hispanidad. How would you define that?
So, La Hispanidad is, for me, I think of it as Hispanic heritage or Hispanic legacy. People oftentimes get confused. They hear the word Hispanic, they hear the word Hispanidad, or anything that sounds like Spain, and they assume Spain. They think Spanish nationalism. They think Spaniards, which is not necessarily the case. Hispanic is not a nationalism. It's a cultural. It's a subculture, I would say. So, for example, I'm proud to be an American, but I'm a Hispanic American. So, my parents are Mexican. We speak Spanish. We have a culture and a history that is Hispanic. And whether we're Native American, it's not a racial thing either. I'm half Native American. My father's Huichol from Nayarit. And just as Hispanic, from the food that we eat, from the lifestyle. So, Native Americans, Europeans, they can be Hispanic. It's definitely a cultural thing, and it definitely has its shared values as well. Honestly, it's traditionally Catholic, Christian. So yes, I think those are some of the more key components of what it means to discuss Hispanidad, Hispanic heritage for me.
Okay, and then how about Latin?
Latin is what we confuse oftentimes. I would say Iberian for things. So when we talk about Latinos, you hear it a lot in the media. It's popular. Like, I'm Latino. Don't call me Hispanic. Don't call me Mexican. I'm Latino. Don't call me Spanish. But Latino is not really a correct term. It's too ambiguous, meaning it's too broad. It incorporates too much. Because to be Latin would have to be somewhere in Rome, right? In where they spoke Latin, the actual language Latin comes from. So it's just not a correct term, right? Iberian would be a more appropriate term, especially when you say Iberian American to refer to Brazilians as well, because Iberian Peninsula is what we're discussing here. And so it's basically the Americas that have been influenced by Iberians. And so it's basically a mixture of Americans, indigenous, and Iberians, whether that's Spanish or Portuguese, right? Latin is, if you talk about Latino, right, how you start to it gets a little more confusing, because then you start to think, wait, what Spanish is not Latin? What Portuguese is not Latin? What even English has Latin in it? What is Latin Spanish? What is Spanish from Spain? Is that what, Germanic Spanish? Is that Slavic Spanish? Is that Arabic Spanish? It doesn't make any sense. So everything definitely has a lot of Latin in it already. But anyways, I think that's important to mention.
Okay, and then the last term, one term that's gets a lot of beef, is colonizer. How would you define that?
A colonizer.
Yes.
So we hear colonization a lot, right? It's a very demonized term. I've heard individuals on social media talk about how violent colonization, machista colonization, has made us this way, that way, and this way, right? But I think it gets confused a lot, because we have a history of conquest, and we assume everything was slaves and gold, right? So I think it's important to understand that there are two types of settling, So I think what we have now, everything is the product of some type of colonization, right? Some kind of settling, right? Where we had to get our water from irrigation canals, where we've learned to animal husbandry to get our food, from the types of houses we live in, So this is the product of hundreds and hundreds of years of conquest and settling. And unfortunately for some people, they find the word colonizing or colonization or coloner as like some demonic term, right? But I think it goes into two different types of I would say settling, right? people coming in, migration, right? Because it is like a migration when you have people coming in from another place and they're going somewhere else and they're setting up and they're bringing about their ways of being, right? Their lifestyles and their values. We have, as Gustavo Bueno has said, we have the predatory empire and a generative empire. And so what we Hispanistas, what we refer to as a predatory empire, would be the colonization that we do see, and we simply call colonization from the British, where they set up colonies so they can extract raw materials, whether it be taxes or just materials for whatever reason, and they're bringing it back to the metropolis, into their capitals, where the generative empire is a little bit different. And that's what as Gustavo Bueno has stated, is basically a copy of the original, right? And so basically what happened here is that they established viceroyalties in the Americas, the Spanish Empire did, where it became other provinces of Spain. So, and just like in Italy, for example, the Spanish Empire also conquered the southern part of Italy, Sicily as well, and there was a viceroyalty of Naples. Well, we have a viceroy, and with their own viceroy, meaning the representative of the king. They had a viceroyalty of New Spain, right? Not a lesser Spain, not an inferior Spain, a new Spain. It was the same Spain, just broadened, right? And so that's why they built the cathedrals. That's why they built the hospitals, right, for the indigenous people at that. That's why they built universities, right? The first universities in the Americas. So that is what we recognize as, we don't say colonizing, we say these settlements, and eventually became these viceroyalties, like these big cities.
Okay. And I guess one quick topic, since we're talking about history, is how do you see presentism influencing?
Presentism. So we see a lot of presentism in how we review history, and sometimes it comes out like on accident. But basically, it's the prejudice of seeing history, reviewing history with our own eyes, right? With the way that we want to judge things, we see history in that manner. And that's not how historians are supposed to review history, right? So sometimes we'll get some very strongly opinionated people who review history and they see something, and it's completely taken out of context, and they get very angry about it, and they want to judge it according to what we have going on today, our current values, or at least their own values sometimes. So what we have to do is we have to see history within its own context. We have to avoid presentism, which is a type of bias, and we have to go in and we understand what exactly happened and why, and what were all these causes and factors leading up to it. And I think as we go into this discussion about La Hispanidad, Hispanic heritage, it's important to talk about these things, right? To debunk some of these myths. Myths like I think a big one would be like the Spanish Black Legend. But yeah. Did you want to ask me about that part?
Yeah, so, let's go ahead and just cover some of those myths.
Yeah. Okay, so this is very important. So many people don't know about the Spanish Black Legend. I think people can kind of sense it. Some people even favor it, right? But the Spanish Black Legend are historical distortions of the past of Hispanics. So Hispanic history has been very, very much distorted when the Spanish Empire was ruling the world. It was sovereignty is one of the biggest the world has ever seen. Going all the way through Germany right before the Reformation, all the way to the Philippines, where they commercialed with China eventually, and then to South America, North America. So yes, the Spanish Black Legend. What you have here is you have it has its roots, they say, starting with Italy. The Spanish Black Legend that starts kind of amongst Italians. Obviously, it's not as prevalent, and it's just the bud of it all. But what you have here is that when the Spanish Empire begins to conquer in Italy, you have certain Italians, especially with their pride, their history of being Roman, right? They see the Spanish as almost a threat to their pride, or to their own I don't know, their own status maybe. Mm-hmm. But or whether something was going on or not, like whether there was individual grievances within their society at the time. They were some of the first people to start this, what would be propaganda, and there'd be certain types of propaganda. So not all Italians felt this way, but it was pretty. It did exist, and this is kind of the bud of the very beginning of the Spanish Black Legend, and it didn't get too far. And It got really strong during the Protestant Reformation, and it took a different pace because what you have here is you have a lot of these wars breaking out in Protestant Europe with Catholics. You have in Protestant Germany, you have the 30 Years' War. It was on fire. You had people killing each other in droves. You had Catholic Germany, Southern Catholic Germany versus Protestant Europe. And then you had the religious persecutions even within their own territories. You had in Holland as well. You see another page of Spanish Black legend coming out of Holland because they too became Protestant with Guillermo de Orange, William Van Orange, and yes, and so they were able to separate themselves from the Spanish Empire because part of the sovereignty was also belonging to Spain, and then also in England, and you see the English. I don't know how much I have to tell you. I think a lot of people know, but like King Henry VIII became started up his own church, split from the Catholic Church, so he could kill his wives, whatever. But yeah, he just or be with who he wants to be with, But basically, he you see a bunch of propaganda. You see Catholics being persecuted. You see vice versa when it switches. The Catholics take charge of England again. It kind of switches, like with Bloody Mary, But you see how like Bloody Mary, I think, is a good example, right? She's recognized as a bloody killer, but not like King Henry VIII or like or Elizabeth after her, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like, but yet you have under Queen Elizabeth, you have large atrocities as well. You have Catholics in hiding in England, and even up until recently, when England politically there were certain stages where you couldn't be Catholic, so yeah, and these are things that I've come to learn about all this Spanish Black legend. And so anyways, what has happened here is that there is this propaganda, right, that has existed, and I'm sure and it happens all the time with any great empire. The United States has its own level of Black legend, right? The Soviet Union there were people talking about the Soviet Union, talking nonsense about it, right? It's nonsense. It's propaganda that has what now turned into history for the Spain, at least for the Spanish history, because a lot of these myths and distortions go completely unchecked. Especially in the more English-speaking world that we live in now, it's become more. We've adopted the English version of history, and so we hear about things like the Spanish Inquisition. We think the worst, right? And which is not to say it didn't happen, but it was not the boogeyman like everyone is saying it is, compared to all these other both religious and secular atrocities that are happening at the time. But it's not exclusively Catholic nor religious, right? I think that's the overall point. But then you have other things too, like the conquest of the Americas. And so what you have too is that you have the Spanish Black legend, and it's talking about how there was a genocide by the Spanish in all the Americas, right? They just killed all the Native Americans. They're just looking to kill everybody, or you tear them up and all this and that. I mean, this was propaganda that was pushed almost immediately after the Las Casas brought out his Brevísima on the Americas, when he was trying to speak up against injustices that happened. Knowingly, I mean, how would I say, reasonably, I would say, for the Protestant world, they took these lies, because a lot of them were lies, a lot of them were exaggerated numbers. Were not millions of people, more people that existed on the earth at the time that he was talking about. But his point was to drive this home to make a social change for the Spanish theologians and the Spanish monarchs, and that way they can help and make some help with some of the injustices that were happening in the Americas, right? Especially in the Caribbean, I'd say. But this Protestant world took the Brevísima. They made pictures of it, and the pictures it's kind of funny, because the pictures are like they've never seen any indigenous people in their life, so they all look like blonde and white, and they're supposed to be the natives, and they're being murdered and massacred by the Spanish, right? And you have then they have King Philip eating babies and stuff, and he's got tentacles. It's the weirdest cartoonish thing you see, but you see a lot of this propaganda coming out with the printing press being so popularized at that time. And so not only were lies talked about Catholics in general, but even more so on the Spanish Empire, who stayed very faithful to the Catholic Church at that time.
Yeah, and then what would you say? So there is this Black legend being built, right? And from people who obviously don't even know what the indigenous look like. Mm-hmm. Well, what were the protections that the Spanish enacted for the indigenous?
So
during that time
that's
period?
A great question. So I think it's ironic, right, that they're talking about a genocide by the Americas, right? Well, number one, there was no genocide. It was, you do have lots of deaths, right, by diseases and sicknesses, by antibodies that the indigenous people do not have. But let's be absolutely honest. If we're talking, remove the presentism, right? Just like we said, and the sicknesses and like the bubonic plague were just like 100 years before in Europe had wiped out third or 2/3 of the European population, right? You had all these, and we're not out here saying genocide because of a plague up there. But there's all kinds of plagues, and even before the Europeans came, there were plagues in the Hispanoamerica as well, or in the Americas as well. Indigenous people had their own, and there were plagues that were brought from the Americas that got accidentally transferred to the Europeans. It's something that happens. It's something that it's sad, but it's something that it's the reality. It's we had the COVID, like COVID. We have all kinds of sicknesses that just wipe out large groups of people. But to demonize a certain group of people for that, it would be like no different than trying to demonize like Chinese people for COVID-19 or something like that. That'd be completely unacceptable by the same people, right? So that's what I'm saying though, is that what you have here is accidentally these deaths occur. Yeah. Not all the people died though. Not everyone died because of it. And we can clearly see the indigenous population in Hispanoamerica, in Argentina, and even Argentina has its own story, right? After Spain left, right? But even them, they have more indigenous people than like the United States here or Canada, where you had this British colonization, and I would say the manifest destiny that came with, I would say that for me derives mainly from enlightened and Protestant thinkers. Which is a little bit different than like Brazil, right? Like Portuguese or the Catholics, right? That had a different type of thinking of evangelizing and humanizing the indigenous people. And yeah, there were atrocities. This is not to deny anything that may have happened or did happen. Clearly did happen, right? There were individuals who did terrible things, and even people with power, right? But what you see is you have in the chronicles, when you review the history, you have people being held accountable. People like even Christopher Columbus was arrested for torture and tyranny by the Spanish monarch, by Queen Isabel herself. But we're not told that part of the history, aren't we? We're just told about how Christopher Columbus was this evil person, right? And that we're celebrating all of Spain's atrocity, right? By this one figure, right? But you don't talk about how all these other examples of how the Spanish monarch made laws, created legislation to protect the natives, not just protect the natives, so that they could protect their property, their lands. I mean, things that even Emiliano Zapata brought up when he was fighting against the Mexican government. He was calling for indigenous groups to have their lands back that were originally theirs since the viceregal times, thanks to the viceregal times, if you think about it. So there's a lot of laws. There's a lot of las leyes de las Indias. We call them the recopilación de las leyes de las Indias that was made in like the 1680s that is completely been left over. Something that I knew absolutely nothing about too. Like, let's be honest, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad or feel less for not knowing these. I didn't know these things too. I'm a translator. I'm a professional translator. And my curiosity took a turn on all this, the Spanish Black Legend and all this stuff. And, well, actually, before I start there, let me just go back to your final point about the legislation. I think it's ironic that we're saying that, oh, it's genocide. Well, no, it's quite the opposite. Legislation protecting the Native Americans and their property. And we can even go even further. We start talking about the different excelling indigenous people, the noble classes, the indigenous elites who were able to keep mines and actually have their own mines. Within the Spanish Empire, the large majority of the groups of people were indigenous and became mestizos, and that's what many of us are. Mestizos, were mixed blood, right? So yes, and we're talking about genocide and all. It just doesn't add up.
Maybe to add a quick one. How about interrelational?
So from 1514 was the first official intermarriage with indigenous people, then was permitted by the Spanish Empire, by King Ferdinand. I want to say. I think it was right after the laws of Burgos of 1512, but that's when it became more formalized. But they had been mixing already. But this is important too, because if you think about it, they're being Catholic. To be married with someone by the Catholic Church is for life, right? It's not something you should be playing around with. Of course, there's infidelities. Of course, you have people who did just like today. But that's the overall value of the society, right? And it was a very serious one. So to marry with an indigenous person completely humanizes them, but humanizes their whole family and you become brothers with this chief. That was kind of the ultimate goal.
Yes, and I mean, I was quick to make that point because marriage is, like you said, it seemed very different within the Catholic context. It's very serious. So the bond there is pretty much forever.
Yeah.
You know,
Till your death.
and so like you're really bringing in the indigenous culture into your own life.
Into sacraments, the baptism. I mean, why are you baptizing? Why are you looking to evangelize and baptize people who have no souls, right? That makes no sense. If they're not human, why are you even bothering, right? And that's exactly what they did. They evangelized. Not only did they evangelize, and it's funny because here we talk about an extermination. There's no extermination. What you have is maybe an acculturation. And so an acculturation meaning that you're kind of replacing their culture with yours a bit, right? But if you think about it though, like an acculturation where they had to learn how to discuss these topics, Mary, the Virgin Mary, Jesus, baptism, why this is important, to the indigenous people who had never had these kinds of beliefs before. And so in order to do so, they had to learn their languages. The Spanish Empire, even especially along with the Jesuits that came, they were required to learn these different types of languages that were so different all throughout the Americas. You had one language that would be like Chinese to English from the other indigenous language. You had so many different types in the Americas. So fortunately, the Spanish were able to grammatize their languages even before English was grammatized. Nahuatl it had a grammatical structure before English did. And before German, and Quechua as well. Nahuatl is the Mexica language. Quechua is the Peruvian language from the Incans. So, why does this matter? Because this goes quite contrary to the extermination of culture and the extermination of people that we're heard all the time. We're being told all the time. It's completely fabricated.
That's a really good point. Let's see. And how, I guess, moving on from, since we kind of understand that they're being protected by laws and they're being introduced into interrelationships, what is the relationship between the U.S. and the Spanish? And how different was the relationship between the British and the United States?
So, I also want to, it's interesting. Like I had mentioned before, I feel like the colonization brought by the United States and by the British, I've told you before that it is different. There's the manifest destiny. You can clearly see it in the examples of California, where we live here. Being in California, and especially I think in the light of the Saint Junipero Serra statues being torn down throughout the state, and his good name being defamed all over the place by academics as well, even historians. It's wild that even historians go there. You would reserve that for activists, but yes, what you see, I think, is a good example of how different the United States, primarily Protestant and enlightened, I mean, like even secular, right, versus the traditional Catholics that were here before them. And so, Junipero Serra was sent over to California, along with Gaspar de Portola, and to set up missions and towns, presidios, throughout California. Just like they had been doing in the Southwest for hundreds of years before. What you have here, you have rules and laws legislating how to evangelize the natives. You couldn't force baptisms, right? You couldn't force people into missions, right? And I think those are some myths right there. You couldn't. You had to learn the languages. And you had some indigenous groups coming in all at once, so they spoke totally different languages. And so Spanish obviously was practically the main language that was spoken in these missions and throughout all the Americas, because, as I said before, it was more practical sense, and which has benefited us now, Hispanics, whether we're Argentinian, Mexican, Guatemalan. That's what is our values and our language that unites us the most, right? But anyways, you have this going on. The Spanish in California didn't get in touch with every single indigenous person. It was very far from the main capital of the Viceroyalty, Mexico City. So to get supplies, to keep things running, it was very tough. And it was also independently run a little bit more. They had their own political leaders within the missions, the indigenous people. And this is in the 1700s. What other European settlement was doing something like this at that time? And so, anyways, they're also teaching in these missions. They teach irrigation, animal husbandry, lifestyle, things for them that were just common lifestyle stuff. Right? It was labor. It was work. They had requirements of keeping it to about 7.5 hours every day. It was not every day. They had days off. They had holy days off. In fact, I think someone made mention that they might have had more days off than we do now, and yeah, because of all these holy days. And so, anyways, these are things that could completely looked over, right? And so this work was we've been told was replete of forced labor. That's what we're told, right? That's the exaggeration we've been told. But in reality, what it was a negotiated relationship with the natives, and where their own work benefited themselves, where they worked and toiled for their own food, their own meals, and everything for themselves. Even a lot of their discipline too was within their own selves. So, and you also had the military. The military is completely excluded from these communities as well, and that was something that Friar Junipero Serra had to overlook, right? Of course, we have talks of runaways being brought back, but honestly, it's something that it's not very uncommon even till this day. If I were to run away from my responsibilities till this day, or I would be pulled back into it. I can't just have a child and just go, right? Like there's things that we're called in our societies to uphold, to have, we're just held to a standard like that, right? So this was also at that time it was just something that happened, right? Every once in a while. It wasn't all the time, but it was every once in a while. But what historians or what activists like to do is they try to get these individual isolated events out of like a huge time frame. You have only certain events and the incidents, and then they try to milk it. And that's what I said in a podcast way before. I said they try to milk all these little individual cases as if it happened all the time. Mm-hmm. But in reality, if you start to look at things like that, we see how many deaths happen over here down the street. You heard someone got shot. You would think it's happening in every single block, like everyone's getting shot every single day, right? But that's part of why we do the work that we do, right? We discuss the numbers, we discuss what really happened, we discuss the legislation, we discuss the attitudes toward the indigenous, because you start to see especially from Junipero Serra, someone like that, who's been defamed so much, but he actually had a strong love for the indigenous people. But anyways, yeah, eating, yeah. Anyways, and I think something fun to mention is de pozole, right? Pozole is what we think of Mexican, right? Yeah. But no, it's been around even before Mexico was a country.
That's crazy. So then, since we're talking about pozole, what are some cultural things we have adopted?
Well, the food. I think the cattle, mm-hmm. That was brought over by the Spanish first. The horses, the pigs. A lot of what we eat, they're maybe typical Mexican dishes, right? Like we have our our tacos, right? Mm-hmm. But the first tacos were eaten with the indigenous and the Spanish, the conquistadores. Mm-hmm. They made the first tacos with meat, with the pork. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that we eat that, they definitely have indigenous influences in it. And I'm proud to say that they do, right? But they also have these European influences, and we shouldn't demonize the one and over romanticize the other, right? Well, and that goes the other way too with our Spanish ancestry as well. I think it'd be ridiculous to over romanticize, the glory of the Spanish Empire and all this and that. No, there's incredible feats, but at the same time, no one is perfect, right? Mm-hmm. But I think what we have here is not just we just have so much simplification that nobody's even willing to dive into the history, and so it's been completely lost. Like why would I be the only one talking about this? Right? I would think we have to look at how many Hispanic Americans we have in this country, in the United States. You would think they would be ready for this kind of talk, or they'd be ready for all this. But I think it's good that it starts somewhere, because, and I have a feeling maybe, and that part of some of the history that's been told to us, it's not by accident, right? That we're told to despreciar one side and not the other, right? That Spanish language that we have is a big strength. It's a unity of about 500 million people in the world. And in the United States, we have about 60 million people Spanish speaking. So out of 300 plus million. So, that's a pretty strong advantage. And I say all the time, it's not by accident that Hispanic America is divided into 21 different countries, or 20 different countries, but Canada and Brazil are not. Because they had more people, historically, they've had more of the fear of Spanish speakers.
What is the Hispanic heritage and history in the United States?
So, as I had mentioned before, California was brought into the Spanish Empire. It was kind of explored before, but it was brought in around the 1769, before the United States was even a country or independent. And Yes, and so, but this whole southwest of of Hispanic America, the south and the west, I would say, from Florida, Arizona, Texas, um, in New Mexico, Arizona, California, they were all settled in different ways, right? By different in different times, and even earlier than California. From Don Juan de Oñate, a very controversial figure, till and even in many other places explored, even though they weren't settled, because as again, it was some terrains were very hard to get settled, towns going. Um, and what people don't understand is the indigenous influence in these settlements. So what does that mean? Why is this important? It's important because we're constantly told this narrative of how it was the Spanish versus the brown people or the indigenous people, right? Like, but that's not always the case. That's just for the movies. What you have is in the Spanish Empire, you have it incorporating the indigenous person from the neophytes from really early on, and then from their descendants onward, and their descendants becoming people of great power in some cases. Even Don Juan de Oñate is a good example. His wife was the great granddaughter of Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, and the granddaughter of Hernan Cortes. So, and that's the guy that hates indigenous people. People don't even know that his battalions were full of indigenous Tlaxcalan allies, the same descendants from the allies that won in the conquest a few years before that. So yes, did he have his own incidents, his own issues? Yes, he did. But I guess that's for a different discussion, right? But to call him just a genocidal racist is not necessarily true, based on race at least. So, anyways, you have these types of allies, indigenous allies, participating in the expeditions and explorations in many occasions. And so, what you see like Nahuatl names in different areas of Mexico to this day. And why is that? Because not these areas weren't necessarily Nahuatl; they weren't Aztec areas. No, it was because the indigenous allies that helped in the conquest against the Mexica Empire, the bloodthirsty Mexica Empire at that killed way more people than the conquistadores, the Spanish conquistadores from the peninsula were killing. I mean, they were doing it routinely, but yet, and that's why they were able to develop and build these allies with all these indigenous people so quickly. It's not just the guns, germs, and steel like we're told all the time. No. Without the indigenous allies, none of this is possible. With the Spanish conquest of the Mexica Empire is seen as a European accomplishment, not only is it that, it's also it's a Native American accomplishment where they were able to defeat their oppressor. And many of them saw Hernan Cortes as a liberator. Funny how that can switch, how a flip that is. And so you have here, Hernan Cortes is no saint, okay? But you have a very complicated man who built the first hospital in the Americas, the Sacred Heart of Jesus Hospital in Mexico City, and that's for indigenous people as well. Who was the greater number of people in the armies of the conquest and in the general population afterward? You have different types of societal institutions like the Guayaquil. You have that were indigenous institutions before that the Spanish merely adopted. You have the Mita in Peru. Again, a Quechua word. Another institution that the Spanish merely adopted as well. And why does this matter? It matters because it goes to show how the Spanish Empire and the conquistadores became a part of the society and vice versa. So anyways, when discussing the conquest, I think it's important to discuss also the other face of the conquest, which is the indigenous side of and they're basically giving them credit too, right, where credit's due. So very similar too is that in the Incan Empire, they weren't as bloodthirsty as Mesoamerica, or especially not the Mexica Empire, but they did have human sacrificing as well. But they had their own political instabilities. They had brothers that were fighting different factions. It's ironic. It's interesting because the conquest by Hernan Cortes was not sponsored by the crown. In fact, it was against the local governor of Cuba. He actually went to go arrest him, and Hernan Cortes actually took all his stuff and his soldiers, and he burned the ships. And then he said, we're either conquering or we're gonna die conquering. And so, yes, that's why it's kind of complicated to say the Spanish did this, Spanish did, like, yeah, there were Spaniards that did this, right? But a lot of these conquests and a lot of these explorations were on the private dime. It was individual expenses. But But Francisco Pizarro went to the Incan Empire, and he saw one side was fighting for another. I'm not gonna say he's a saint either, but he was ambitious. And what he did is that he sided with one side, and what happened was is that his side won. His side won. His side, they defeated the other side, and it's interesting because you start to talk about the how much participation the indigenous people had in the conquest of the Incan Empire. And the archaeologists now have found that these cadavers, the remains of the indigenous conquered people of the empire, that a lot of their injuries were by other indigenous people. Loads of them were by tools and weapons from the indigenous people. Everything that they've been recording and archiving has been correct. And also verified by these remains, and that's just one of many things. Especially in the Incan Empire, I would say is one of the more loyal Hispanic countries. Peru is one of the more loyal Hispanic countries throughout history, and also one of the more wealthy ones too. And you start to see that how many hospitals were built in that area. I think there was like 5 in Lima by itself. You start to see just how much they were building almost immediately. And yes, thanks to the Incans, right? Thanks to the Incans that supported the Spanish. And they were rewarded too. Their houses were recognized as noble houses, just like they had noble houses in Europe. They had noble houses in the Incan Empire. You had noble houses in the Mexica area. And they carried on that Inca name. You have people, came down to the point where this lineage was respected for generations, where you had even Spanish elite families like the Loyolas that mixed with the Incan families after generations. So you have like these weddings painted and with their noble families' houses finally aligning together. I mean, it's incredible, but this history is not talked about. Why? And you know why? It's because we're told it's all just slaves and slaves and gold. And then people stop doing the history. Yeah. They feel disenfranchised.
And do you also feel like there is a sense that before these colonizers, before the conquest, it was all peace, right?
No.
There's this
absolutely not
Russoian assumption that there's just this perfect harmony. There's no problems. Like they came and brought Western civilization, imposed it upon them, and conflicts just started arising.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Rousseau's theory of the noble savage. And it's basically the idea that without traditional thinking, without traditional education, everything would be at peace. It would be like Adam and Eve right before the fall, or before the kick out of paradise, right? It's not, absolutely not. And the evidence is all there. Archaeological evidence, everything points against that. You leave people together without any education doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna have like peace in the land. Like it's naive. It's naive, and it's naive to think that the indigenous people were like that before the Spanish came. Absolutely not. You have, and as I said, I think that's another one. I think, right, the whole indigenous people killing other indigenous people, and another one too is very interesting is that there was challenge, right? Some people want to bring up like, oh, maybe the Spanish just made all this up, right? All this conflict, they made it all up just they could gain power, right? Divide and conquer, right? I've been told that too, and then you start to see like, wait a minute, a lot of the accounts that they're telling are being more verified with the more archaeological evidence that's being provided now. Like I remember there's this one structure of skulls, human skulls, by the Mexica Empire, right? And it's like 2 columns with a whole wall of skulls, right? Built all by skulls. So that means you need hundreds of people. And they said that the Spanish had said they'd seen lots of these, but as we've been told, as we know, because it did happen, they went and they destroyed many of these displays, and whether they're goddesses and their temples and all these things that they found extremely demonic, right? They destroyed these things too, but some people were questioning if that was even a thing. Like, no, they just made all this up so they can just take over everybody, right? They can just like rape and steal everything. And then you start to, but then recently, a couple years ago, an apartment complex collapsed from within, and they found another one in Mexico City. Mm-hmm. And so it just totally verifies. I mean, it's constant. The truth is there, right? And I think it's a hard pill for some people to swallow. But I think I might have mentioned in the past that a lot of this anti-Spanish hate, right? Like, I'm not Spanish, right? But it's kind of to me it's a little bit it's naive, and I think it comes a lot from our nationalisms that we feel. That I think nationalisms get in the way of us being able to tell the truth about our history, the truth about our culture, the truth about our faith and our values. honestly. We can't tell it honestly with these nationalisms that sometimes get in the way, right? You can love your country, and I think it's appropriate that everybody loves their country because, I mean, what else are you going to do? Destroy your country? No, it's good to build, and build, right? But at the same time, don't let that get in the way of you being able to tell the truth, right? And I see that, as I said before, with the whole California thing. Oh, and the whole California thing, too. I forgot to answer that question about how the indigenous, what the difference is here, right? So you had by the Spanish Empire, right? After the Spanish left, the Mexico wins its independence, right? Spanish gets kicked out. So the sovereignty comes from being very big with Spain, right, to being very small with Mexico, and which emboldens the United States to take the United States, the rest of what we now have is the United States, the Southwest that belonged to Mexico, and to start a war with Mexico. Something that wasn't tried when the Spanish Empire was all one, because it was a much bigger sovereignty, much scarier boogeyman, right? Yeah, Mexico gets its independence, and very shortly later, like maybe 30 years plus later, they lose their war against the United States of America, a war that the United States brought on to Mexico. And they ended up getting California and all the rest. And then from there, it gets worse for the Native Americans. And it's not just worse for the Native Americans in the United States, but also worse for the Native Americans in Mexico, worse for the Native Americans in Argentina. We can go into that a little bit more too. But in these different republics that come off the dismembered body of the Spanish Empire, the indigenous people are left without the same legislative protections. So they're more vulnerable to these new republics that take over. And the United States was the most vicious one. There is a genocide in California, and I not to like make English speakers feel bad, not to make them hate their country or anything like that, but it's the truth. It's the history here, and there was not just vigilante groups that rose from the newcomers of different types of English speakers from the East, but other people from around the world started to come, especially during the gold rush, and the population jumped extremely high. And they started to chase out the indigenous people in the areas where they were looking for mines. And as I said before, a lot of these indigenous people didn't even know the Spanish. They never even met the Europeans before. A lot of them in certain parts of California. But as it became incorporated into the United States, it became they were seen as very dangerous. The indigenous people were seen as dangerous, and that narrative that had been following indigenous people since, and something that we see in different parts of like Indiana and all throughout all the United States, the same pattern of fear and race wars occurred. And you had even the first governor of California talking about how there needs to be a race war, how the Indians will never be able to live with us white men, how it's either like us or them. And then you see the actual wars happening. And you see, like the federal government reimbursing the state of California for $1 million+, and at the time was a lot of money for weapons, guns, for militia services, all in these race wars. And these race wars took place in like everywhere throughout California. And unfortunately, Hispanics also were killed during this time. And this is the time period we're talking about, like Joaquin Murrieta. A lot of Mexican Americans, Chicanos, know about Joaquin Murrieta and how he had his basically he had his wife killed, and he had his stuff stolen, his brother killed, and how he became a vigilante afterward, and like he was like a bandido, and he was killing people almost like a serial killer he's painted as. But it's during the same time period where a lot of Americans are also coming from the Mexican-American War, where you have in Mexico lots of indigenous and Spanish speakers fighting in this war, and they're coming to California and seeing a lot of the same faces, a lot of the same types of people, and they feel that they're soldiers. And so you have them moving into this new area, and they're wiping out the indigenous population a lot. And a lot of these indigenous groups don't survive, and there's just a lot. The chronicles go on and on and on. A good book to read about this. Not a good book to read about the missions, but a good book to read about this time period. It's called American Genocide, I think it's 1848 until 1870. It's this little journal clip of it, but it's during the gold rush basically, and he goes on and on, talks about what the politicians were saying, what they were voting on, the laws against the Native Americans to make their life like harder, a whole bunch of stuff. So it's kind of it's a ruthless book, but to get light of the differences of the Spanish Empire and what they were doing, and the Protestant enlightened thinkers were doing is very different.
And a quick note: we'll provide a link for
any
sure. Books that are mentioned.
Oh, for sure.
And then so one thing you mentioned is that with the Spanish being kicked out, all sense of litigations that were protecting protecting indigenous also left with them.
Yeah.
So that's key to remember, because when you have a certain group leaving, you're having their culture, every way of being leaving with them, and the remnants that are kept could either be nourished by the incoming culture, by the incoming laws that are coming in their way. So what are laws that came with the British that really just changed the way, or maybe not the laws, but the customs and the way they treated the indigenous?
Oh, well, I think one that comes to my mind off the top of my head in the Shasta County, there was a lot. There was rewards for heads of indigenous people, and that's right there is financial profitability to kill. I mean, that's. I mean, that's gets. I don't get any more direct than that. And then you have all these other laws that came into place of orphan children being turned into servants, and so you had certain vigilante groups go in and kill families to get the children. And they were really seen as like pests. I mean, it was a different mentality. They were seen as like we would see rats, right? That's kind of the thought of process for a lot of these newcomers. There were stories told by mountain men, these militia groups, mountain men that one would come across another and they would brag about how they killed some indigenous person up on the way, and it was just kind of like nonchalant talk.
What's the name of the football team? Is it Redskins?
Oh yeah, the Redskins. I don't know if they call themselves that anymore, but yeah.
But that's just an example of the culture kind of just. I mean that you didn't necessarily have the case with the Spanish.
No, so you did have. I mean, we did have. They did have like these pictures, caste system. They call them caste system. But they weren't. But they weren't defining everyone's potential by these pictures, right? Yes. They were observations, like we make observations today. You see someone that's different color, and this is a person different color. But it's not just to dehumanize them. It's just that we observe things, Yeah. And you had that in Mexico, but which is ironic though, because sometimes that gets brought up like, oh look, they have caste systems. They couldn't leave that caste. You're like, well, not necessarily. They were mixing with the other caste. Look how much mixing is actually happening in this other caste. A lot of the mixing was not allowed in the United States up until the 1960s, where they couldn't even marry, black people. And so I was like, but this was already happening for 500 plus years. I said, you have also like, I look at it differently. Like, look at all these different types of people: mulattoes, mestizos, chinos. All these different types of people. That has been happening for a long time. And in fact, if you want to get even deeper with it, if I really want to tackle it, well, look at how many rich people that are of color in these pictures. Look how the aristocracy of the African woman, or the aristocracy of the indigenous woman, the rich African American woman, and their children, and they're with, and then look at the poor Spanish white guy. It's like it's interesting. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
So yeah, to be self-made is a bit different within the Spanish Empire. Yes. It was a very different experience. Yeah. And not all European experiences are the same. Yeah, and I think that's where people go wrong generalizing often.
It's interesting you say that, because we're directly a product of being mixed.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, Me and you both. Yeah.
Yeah, it's if it weren't the case. I mean, if they, we wouldn't know if we actually would exist if the Spanish had a different way of interacting.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there is a mentality in Hispanic America right now, from Mexico all the way to Argentina. There's a subordination that people feel. They feel like they're like, oh, like we're so poor, like, oh, we don't have nothing to like be proud about, like, oh, I wish the English had conquered us, not the Spanish, the lousy Spanish, right? Like they didn't bring anything. They only brought us disaster and poverty, right? And I've been told that all kinds of times, and I'm like, but you probably wouldn't even be here. You ancestors probably wouldn't have even survived. You see these different areas. They're just like they're like, if you check the United States, like where are the indigenous people? They're barely in reservations. They barely survived the reservations too, because a lot of the reservations, they're not like how they are now. They were, when they were first set up, they were like little concentration camps. People had very little food coming in. It was a lot. There's a lot going on, and so that's what I'm saying, is that like, yeah, people don't really know the full story. And it's interesting because I remember a guy, a history teacher at that. I'm not gonna say names, but I remember he was telling me, we were getting to this talk. He didn't like some of the things he had to say. He thought I was like some kind of Spanish national, like some fascist or something. I'm like, dog, you don't even know. Like that's not what I'm doing here at all. But he was like getting really concerned. He was like, yeah, well, like look at all this poverty. Like this is because of the Spanish. He said that, and I said, no. I said, in fact, I said Mexico City was richer than Madrid at one point. I said Mexico City was richer than the United States, and their they had more population sizes than like Boston at one point when they started doing the first census. I said they also was only it was competable. It was competing with London and Paris. I said that's what both the Spanish and the indigenous built together, right? And he said no, that's because of the Aztecs. They were so rich. And I said, wait a minute, but didn't you just say that they're poor? Wasn't your original argument that it's all impoverished? No, you're exactly playing into my point. That under the Spanish Empire, it was flourishing, and you start to lose. They lose after they get their independence, after the Spanish Empire gets dismembered into various fractions of various republics, and they start to, obviously, as we see, the poverty that comes down from losing half your territory, from getting beat by the United States. It's a very different. Those are different reasons. It's not the conquest that made them poor. And so, and I think that's why I like to talk about the conquest in general too, because as I said before, the indigenous people participated in these conquests in the Incan Empire, right? I think that's going back to that, right? You have their lineages. Another one too is that in the Philippines, the Filipinos, I feel like, are also they feel subordinated too. There's a lot of Filipinos that I've met that feel a certain type of way toward the Spanish Empire. It's very similar to how I've seen it in Mexico. I mean, they are so similar in so many ways. We'll probably even have the same cousins. We probably have the same descendants.
We're very similar to the Philippines.
They have Spanish blood in them. A lot of them do too, mixed just like us. Not only do they have the Spanish blood, they have indigenous blood too. Tlaxcalan allies also accompanied the Spanish. They were the Spanish Empire. They went to the Philippines and beat the samurai in the Philippines, in Cagayan Islands. And they don't. But we're not. This whole anecdote gets lost. So I think that's another important thing to make, is that our Filipino brothers also went through a similar situation too. But that's a whole other rabbit hole that I could get into.
And it's funny you said that, because I immediately can bond with a Filipino. Whether it be like we're culturally very similar. And so what would you say? How can we unify or become?
I think the history needs to be told correctly, because that's part of the problem. The Filipinos, they feel like, at least for them, they feel that they were just like oppressed, raped, and violated by the Spanish Empire for 300 years, right? That's the same story that they're being told too. And it's a little different because they have also had a lot of English. The United States has occupied them too, right? And it's kind of like us in the Southwest here in the United States, I would say. But I don't know how much you know about their Philippine history, about the Spanish being there and the independence the Philippines got from the Spanish Empire. But it was funded and it was supported by the United States government. So the United States decided to say, hey, look at we're trying to get Cuba independent. We're trying to get the Caribbeans independent. The Caribbeans independent. Let's get you independent too, from Spain. The evil Spain. So they started shooting out propaganda. Some of the propaganda you can see now is like some like guerrilla Spanish guy. He's taking and all the girls in Cuba like cartoons, right? So they started doing the same thing for the Philippines. But the Spanish didn't really put up much of a fight. Like they just left. And when they decided to agree with the United States, okay, you're gonna be the middle guy here. We're gonna give you the keys to the Philippines, and you're gonna give it to the Filipinos, right? No, the United States kept it. Said no, we're gonna stay here, and they ended up emptying out their banks that they had from the commercial for hundreds of years, that they've been the main commercial entry point from China. Then they've been doing business with. So they had lots of money, lots of gold, and lots of money over there, and they lost a lot of it. And the president of the Philippines was so mad. That he had become a Mason along with a lot of the other Masons that he became friends with in the United States. He said, I'm leaving this. This is everything you've been telling me. You guys just played me. And then he ended up even going to the funeral of the Spanish king and saying that, and everyone was surprised to see him. Like, didn't you get independence? Why are you here? Don't you not like Spain? It's like, no, under Spain we were seen as citizens, but under the United States, we suffered, And so he admitted it himself too in his older years. And there's it's pretty amazing, right? And then you start to see the baile folclórico. It's all throughout Hispanoamerica. It's in the Philippines too. The dresses, the foods, the languages. Another language that the Spanish were grammatized really early on was Tagala, and they had so like they were making these languages. They were grammatizing all these languages for a lot of local populations, like in Guarani in South America. And also they're participating other indigenous names I could drop, like the Guaranis, the Otomis against the Chichimeca conquest, where you had a military general for the Spanish Empire. He was indigenous, I can't pronounce his name, Chochicochimitl, and he was ended up. I know I butchered his name, but it's a long one, right? He has a Spanish name too, a Castilian name, but he was a general. He was and he fought in the Chichimeca conquest, right? The Chichimecas was another indigenous group on the outskirts, and they were very ruthless too. They're also cannibals, also, and the Otomís helped the Spanish Empire in these wars. A little bit after the Mexica, the fall of Tenochtitlan, a little bit after that. But he was known to even cut off the ears of Spanish gunmen who didn't obey his orders. And so I mean, to talk about the social stratus was more important regardless of race.
So, as you know, I'm Guatemalan, and what would you say we should do within the Central America to kind of build strong unity?
So I don't think we all have to be the same country, and I think people get that mixed up. They're like, he wants everyone to be Spain again. Like, no, that's not what I want. But I do think that we need to start sharing intel, resources. I think maybe develop a union would be a good start, like the European Union has a union. Europe is extremely different. Each country they've been at war for way longer than we have ever had any wars in Mexico against, Argentina versus Paraguay. I know there's been a lot of wars, and unfortunately that's one of the outcomes of the dismemberment, the fall of the Spanish Empire. It was an actual fall and an actual collapse of a real classical empire, the last classical empire. And so you have a lot of these remaining municipalities fighting amongst each other, and there was a lot of fratricidal wars, brothers killing other brothers, and that did not happen before the fall of the Spanish Empire. And a lot of these fratricidal wars were also propelled by outside foreign interests. So I think it's important that that we stop being so subordinated in our way of thinking, that we appreciate our culture, we tell the truth about our history, we tell the truth about the Spanish Black Legend. And I think that maybe, if politically, in a larger scale, I think, a union for those Hispanic American countries is great. Also, being here in the United States, we have a little differently. We're kind of outside. We're a little bit like outsiders, right? Because we're English speakers, but we're Hispanic Americans. But I think I think honestly we can propel even our own United States country forward with a lot of might, especially with our values.
Yeah, and it's like for me, for example, like since we've built a strong friendship for a long, long time. Like, I'm down to rep a Mexican flag. Like, I'm not afraid to rep a Mexican flag.
Yeah.
Beforehand, maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe not at all. And because there's always this running jealousy of some sort, right? Or within each individual country, like, oh, I can't, if he makes it, I can't make it. Yeah. There's this zero-sum game always happening within these Central American countries. And so if he makes it, I can't make it. So I had to bring him down somehow. And like you said, the only people who enjoy watching us are the people in power. People who can...
People outside of our culture.
Exactly.
They I think there's... Yeah. I've told people, you know who loves that you hate the Spanish so much? Are these people, these historical rivals. The Spanish don't hate it as much as these other people. They don't... Nobody else loves it more than they love it. You may think you're repping Mexico, you're repping your country, Colombia, whatever it is, by talking shit about the Spanish. No, in reality, is you're just showing your division, and you're just showing how weak we are divided. And it's that people are your rivals. They love that. People who don't understand your culture, they don't understand your values, they don't understand your language, they love it. So that just letting you know.
And it's the same. I mean, so not only say you don't talk about the Spanish, but you talk about the Mexicans, you talk about the Central Americans. Mm-hmm.
That's true too.
In a sense, you're attacking your own identity.
Absolutely.
So
if it's stereotypical, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So if we could work, just building that sense of camaraderie among all the Hispanic,
the kinship,
then it will be different. Mm-hmm. Your success will be my success.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's like if the Central Americans in Salvador is improving, like I'm happy for them. If Nicaragua's improving, I'm down for it. Whatever it is, so kind of just being down to rep a different country and truly being optimistic about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's super necessary, and I'm seeing it among my friends. I mean, I know you'd be down to rep a Guatemalan flag.
Oh yeah, for sure. I have a jersey. I'm not Guatemalan, but I love y'all.
And I mean, I know you. Like, if I had one of my good friends who came over to my house, And there was a bunch of, like, we were all Guatemalans. He was the only Mexican, and he was pretty quiet that one time because Guatemala scored. And the first time we were winning, it just felt like a blessing, right? And so we had to cheer, and he stayed quiet. But then Mexico eventually won the game, and that's why I'm cheering on the side, super quiet. And so, but it just, actually building those friendships and willing to have those conversations, whether it be the political conversations that these powerful, strong people need to have in their independent countries. They need to be able to talk to each other about these topics without feeling the need that they're somehow giving in.
Yeah.
And it'd be the same way. Like, for example, when I played for a Mexican team in the adult league, people are like, "Oh, you're kind of like selling yourself." They saw me with the Mexican jerseys, like, "Oh, this guy's fake, bro." And I was like, "Really? No." I was like, "Some of these fools they treat me better than you." So I was like, "Nah," And so just truly don't be afraid to be looked at differently if you want to build decent relationships with different kinds of people.
Yeah, I call it the narcissistic differences. Like, oh, I'm so much better because I have mariachi, right? You're like, brother, like most of what your culture shares with your southern, the southern part of your country is very much more like the next country over is in the south than it is in the north. It's like, but what really does unite us is our language, our values, our history, oftentimes even our own DNA.
Yeah, and then what would be, like, if you had 3 important things that you would want the audience to remember, what would those be?
What I would say that well, not to hate yourself. I think that's number one. And that goes even for people who I would assume would be historical rivals of ours. WASPs, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. I don't really like to demonize people based on generalize them like that. But just historically, I can see a lot of people online getting upset. Being kind of told these things, and I wouldn't even want them to hate their own country. I wouldn't want them to hate their families. I think that's also just to let them know right now that I think building even our country in the United States, it's the United States. We're gonna have to be united, right? Like it's, despite our differences. I think for the Hispanic people, I think a lot of them belong to countries just like our country here in the United States. We know that things are not going well. Our leaders don't always represent us well, and so I think for them, what you see is you do see a high uptick of Black legend just nonsense being spewed from these fools. Some of these people they seem like they're senile too, and they're speaking just absolute nonsense. I mean, talking like the Venezuelan president, I'm talking the Mexican president, I'm talking about the Peruvian president, I'm talking the Bolivian president, I'm talking all kinds of presidents out there that are just saying things, right? That honestly, it just hurts. It just hurts them. It hurts them more than it makes things better. So I would say for the Spanish-speaking people, para los que hablan español y viven en esos países hispanoamericanos con los presidentes que hablan disparates en contra de España y de su hispanidad, que continúen con su lucha por la unidad de nosotros y que los queremos mucho desde California y que somos un pueblo con los mismos valores, la misma historia, el mismo espacio y el mismo idioma. Y bueno, I think that's about all I would like to say.
Thank you, Zacarias, for bringing a wealth of information and putting yourself out there. I know it's not easy.
Thank you, dog. I appreciate you.